habits are habit forming, and so we have patterns of behavior that have been observed from which I think we can learn something about the probability of the pattern repeating in the future. So I don't even think it's any more a question of trustworthiness. I think it's just a question of probability. The United States has demonstrated a particular pattern of behavior for a long time, and it is important to take that pattern of behavior into account when you are dealing with the United States. The specifics around this particular phone call, of course, are kind of interesting. And when you look at the readouts and the social media postings from President Trump, it's quite clear that the message or the substance of that particular phone call, even though it went for over an hour, was quite straightforward, which is that the two sides had agreed on a particular process to address the tariff questions and trade, and that the two sides should stick to the process. That's the first thing. The second point, which was rammed home and which I don't think was necessarily rejected by President Trump's own tweet or Truth Social message, is that stick to your word, which is if we agreed to do something, then you should stick to doing this particular thing for this process. Now, this, of course, has become a relatively common feature of discussions now between China and the United States, where China has developed its own habits of reminding the United States that saying one thing and doing another is not conducive to a constructive relationship. The third message that I think was enunciated through this phone call was also a very simple and direct one, and that is that China will also stick to its position and stick to its principles. So stick to the process, stick to your word, and sticking to its positions and principles. This particular approach, I guess people could say, is a much firmer approach than has been evident in the past. But I would suggest that, in fact, this particular approach is reflective of a general attitude and a strategic calculus that was actually very evident from the meeting in Anchorage, the first meeting between the American and Chinese sides after the Biden administration came to power. And that meeting in Anchorage laid out very, very clearly that China would no longer come to these kinds of meetings as the subordinate counterparty, and that it would assert its positions and insist on being treated as an equal and with respect. So what's interesting now, of course, is that the Americans are flying to the UK to meet with the Chinese counterpart on the trade question because the Chinese counterpart was going to the UK anyway. So I think this tells us something about the general dynamic of this trade question, and that is that China does hold the cards, in large part because China makes the cards. And when the United States can only offer IOUs in return, then there is a big question mark, as we discussed earlier, about the extent to which American IOUs or US dollars is good enough, particularly when the United States persists in imposing all sorts of restrictions and sanctions on Chinese firms and Chinese individuals. There's a school of international relations thinking that increasingly sees the world turning back to this major powers rivalry framework, with the possibilities of spheres of influence becoming the dominant organizational theme between major countries. This is certainly a view that seems to be emerging amongst certain parts of the American policy establishment, though by no means all parts yet. And I'm not sure that the Europeans have necessarily arrived at that view either. I certainly don't think China subscribes to that view. Uh, China's broad view is that uh, all countries in the world exist together, and that there needs to be arrangements that enable all countries to coexist as equal parts of the single globe. So rather than there being this idea of spheres of influence or great power rivalry, uh, China's framing of global affairs is to seek to promote greater interactivity and connections between countries and civilizations that intertwine interests and which recognize that whilst there are differences between civilizations and even at times differences of interests, that there is a need to find pathways to commonalities so that countries can develop in relative peace and I guess pursue their own national and civilizational ambitions. So that's the first thing, is that this idea of great power rivalry and a world that is becoming one dominated by spheres of influence is actually not a framing that China itself necessarily subscribes to. In terms of smaller powers or smaller countries, part of the challenge always is to ensure that you don't get roped in to others' agendas and that you are able to preserve your own capacity to act within reasonable constraints. Right? So no single country can act unilaterally. And this, I guess, is part of the view that China itself has, that the actions of one country need to take into account its impact on others. And in the security arena, this really goes to the question of the indivisibility of security, that the security interests of one nation cannot be at the expense of the security interests of the other or of others, but that in fact the security interests of one nation must be intimately intertwined with the security interests of others so that your interests and my interests become fully aligned. So the challenge for smaller countries is to find pathways in which they can have their interests for security and prosperity aligned with the interests of others, and in fact to mobilize the other nations within a particular ecosystem and within their diplomatic reach, because bear in mind, small countries only have so many diplomatic resources available, to build networks that support a greater degree of independence and non-alignment, or indeed mobilizing ideas such as neutrality as a practical, proactive approach to framing national security and national economic development policy. So they are the sorts of challenges that exist for smaller countries to ensure that they can play a constructive role, not only in ways that enable themselves to navigate a complex world, but to help shape how this complex world actually unfolds. The underpinning notion here is that countries actually have a lot of interests in better coordination and collaboration than they do by allowing themselves to be fragmented through the divide and conquer strategies that some other countries may pursue.